Okay, so Jim, we're going to talk about the World Wide
You
Foundation.
are Ana Paula Perez.
Yes, I am Ana Paula Perez. I work at Social Value Institute here in Mexico City.
Great.
And you're going to give us like a general idea of what did you do in this project, and if you can tell us a little bit of background, why did they look for Vibrancy Institute, or how did you meet with them?
Perfect. And I think if you have it on gallery view, do you have it on gallery view or on just me?
No, I have on gallery.
Oh, perfect. So they can see both of us. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So this project was with the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, also known as the people with the panda logo.
Mm-hmm.
This was in March of 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And they were interested in bringing a systemic and organizational learning perspective to work that they were doing on a specific project in the Coral Triangle Initiative, which is a big, massive coral reef in Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
So we were called in to work with them to see what it would mean for them to bring a more collaborative, systemic approach to thinking of their strategy for this very big area.
Okay, and what challenges were they facing at that time in the organization?
Right, so the coral reef, it was losing a lot of biodiversity, meaning a lot of animals and plants, and the biology was dying, and there were a couple of big reasons that they were attributing to that. One was the massive amount of fishing that's done in that area. By a couple of the very big countries that do a massive amount of fishing in that area, and that they don't really care for the biodiversity in that area. They don't, well, it's not that they don't care for it, they don't care about it. It's not their concern. They're out there to get the fish for their population. And so from indigenous communities to large aid agencies, to governmental agencies, to companies, and the nonprofits, the civil society sector, how could they start to bring everybody together to say, what are we going to do to stop this massive loss of biodiversity in this very critical area?
Okay.
And it was getting much worse, and they weren't clear about how to change the situation.
Okay, and who were there? Like, your first contact was initially with the people from the organization, and then who else was in the dialogue that was very important to start like or what did you do to start like a dialogue with the main stakeholders?
Yeah, so here it was a question of whether the organization themselves, so we were talking with the leadership involved in this initiative, whether they could, whether they wanted to, and how they would go about engaging the stakeholders that were involved in a lot of the work that they were doing across these many islands in this area. How could they shift their understanding, and were they able to see how to do that amongst the stakeholder groups within the organization itself, within the WWF?
Okay, and what type of here I have it, wait. What process did you use to start like mapping, or what exactly did you start doing
we
with
did
that?
some reading on, they sent us quite a bit of reading about what had been done and was being done in the area, to try to bring a lot of people together to shift what was happening, and the successes and failures that they'd met. So one was the literature that they had. We did some further reading on a general understanding of the area and what academics and practitioners saw and were trying to do historically, and also interviewed some of the key players within the organization that had a lot of time in the field working there and understanding, and trying to understand also what was the perspective of this particular organization, and trying to host stakeholder dialogues in the area.
Okay.
So we can try to change something in a generic or a general area, like the coral triangle, but in this particular project, it was, what is the WWF's contribution to being able to do that kind of work in the area?
And what was the main finding, or what was the catalyzer of change, if there was change, or what happened after you studied that?
Good. So what we came up with was ways that they could shift in the kind of work that was done and how they could invite some of the stakeholders in to look at it more directly. We did some systems mapping, and that was more or less helpful, and some framing of how they could create dialogue groups, but dialogue groups around actually getting something changed versus everybody coming together. So a lot of work had been done at getting people to talk to each other, but it hadn't delivered much. But it hadn't changed the direction. So we started to give, if you're going to really take on something this difficult, to change something this hard, these are the big question for you is whether you, and this is a big question in a lot of these kinds of efforts, is do you do the work without the major stakeholders that are causing the problem, or do you include them in the dialogue, in the work together, and do you know how to invite them in? And groups like WWF have very different perspectives internally of whether you include, what they would say, include the enemy, or are they also stakeholders that we need to include? So they're stakeholders we need to include, or we have to fight against them because they're not going to play and they're only manipulative. And so much of what we did in the short time, it was a few weeks that we worked with them, was to facilitate that exploration of which way they wanted to go internally for whether they wanted to include the big fishing fleets in the exploration or they were part of the problem. And what we were able to show them is you can do both. You can come up with a systemic strategy. So we were using strategic clarity framing, was you can either see how to include them and figure out what they need and what they want and how you can shift what they need, so their incentives and their actions in the system with them. And they are very big players with a lot of resources. Or you can understand that they are constant, or they're there and they're doing something. And so is it possible to shift the system even given that force of what they're doing? Okay. Without including them in the dialogue. And what we ended up facilitating was a couple of dialogues within the teams that were trying to take up which direction they would want to go. And that's where our participation stopped. I think that was possibly because what we were pointing at was a bit too hard for them to take on at the time. But it was an interesting effort to see how do you shift a system where one or two groups represent more than half of the damage that's being done, and they don't want to change their behaviors. Okay, so you would say that the learning of this program or of this project was that lack of commitment or dialogue to change is not the best way to go further on a project, or what was it that was missing mainly? Yeah, so you have to be clear on whether and maybe it's a hypothesis that you can go test. But anyways, are we going to try to include the big players, or are we going to say no? And it's a similar issue we faced around bananas or coffee. If you're in the coffee fair trade business, do you include Starbucks or do you not include Starbucks? Do you include Walmart or do you not include Walmart? Are they the enemy, or are they part of the problem that you have to include? And here was another great example of we want to do these things, and a lot of people want to do these things, and do you include a couple of the very, very big actors who probably will not change? You don't have access to them, but is it possible to engage them and shift something or not? And so what we brought to that, so that wasn't ours to decide for them, but was to support them in seeing that they needed to make a decision on that. Are we going to go against, or are we going to go with them included? And then what would we actually have to do in a collaborative process come together to identify, and this is the what we now call the O process, but the strategic clarity process of, well, then if we are going to work together, what is the bigger goal, the deeper shared purpose that we all want? And then how do we each contribute to that, and why and how do we need to change how we work so that we can both get what we want? And so what we showed them was a way that they could go forward, or two ways that they could go forward with and without the big players. And we hosted the dialogue and a couple of meetings that were very high, very hot, very high energy of whether they wanted to do that or not. Just a second, let me turn that off.
No worries.
So that's what we were able to do in that small project, a little systems mapping and a little bit of process to facilitate them and seeing what they could do, two different pathways for that, and to facilitate the beginning to decide which way they wanted to go.
Okay, excellent. So do you want to continue to the PEMEX program or project, or?
Yeah, we could stop this one so that you can.
Okay.